Hello and welcome back to Adventuring Academy. My name is Brennan Lee Mulligan. It is my honor and joy to bring our special guest today. Please give a warm welcome to our incredible friend, my old childhood friend, and the character artist at Heart Machine, set to release Solar Ash Kingdom very soon in the same company that brought you Hyperlight Drifter. My friend and yours, Mr. Jack Covell.
Hello. Hello. Which camera am I looking at?
You can look at this one for you in a close-up, and this is both of us, and that one's just me. So you can look at that one if you want.
Don't look at that one.
Don't look at
if
that
I'm curious, I'll look at that one.
Exactly. Jack, you and I have been playing Dungeons and Dragons since we were, I want to say, like 15 years old.
We were quite small when we started.
Quite small.
We have a great and storied history of the game.
Of the game.
The great game.
The great
Dungeons and Dragons.
In addition, Jack has been in like almost every major campaign I've ever run. Jack not only is one of the 6 PCs in my fabled 10-year-long home game, Aridane, that we've been running for so long. We just played again back at my folks' place upstate. For the first time, we play like every couple months. We play again. We fly across the country to play together. You also
sort of make like a little retreat weekend out of it. Like
little groovy full D&D weekend.
It's infrequent, but
a very potent session. You also played in Storm City, which was the other many years long campaign. So
True.
I'm playing a lot of D&D. So I'll start by saying, as someone who's been playing D&D hardcore for so many years, you have a character who is now 17th level, a deity, a demigod. You're having like the fullest D&D PC experience, ticking all the boxes down the line.
Yeah, it's been a crazy ride.
You also have run a bunch of D&D campaigns as well. And I think that was something that I wanted to kick off the most right away, because you ran one of my favorite campaigns I've ever played in, which was Goblin Trouble, short for Goblin.
That's really nice to hear. Thank you.
It's true. Just Goblin Trouble in Tenborough Country. And I think I would like you to talk a little bit about that campaign, what prompted you to run that, like what your goals were in starting that, because I think that it addresses a point we get a lot on the show, and we get a lot in terms of our questions from the audience, which is there's a sort of an attitude of like, oh, I want to have a game as big and epic as like our home game that we run, or you even think about like the big streams that are at like Critical Role, where like they went to 20th level and defeated Vecna, and Goblin Trouble was specifically and intentionally not that.
Yeah, it was. Well, like there was a lot of sort of contributing things to me starting that little game. Like, I guess thematically, I've always really liked low stakes fantasy. Like, I always find that like when the stakes are like the fate of the world or whatever, you miss out on a lot of like honestly really fun character stuff to play. Like, you're just a person defending your family, you know, like there's lots of low stakes, like not world shaking, but like very, very personal adventures that people can go on. Without like this huge grand thing. So I liked that about it. And then specifically that game, it was like, it was at a time we were both living in New York. We were playing Aridane at that time, but it was like, we played it pretty infrequently, and it was a big, grandiose, intense game. I had run a couple games in the past, and one of the sort of the observations that I had was like, they were a little railroady. So it was sort of very intentionally like, okay, we all are busy. It's, I think, a really relatable situation where like everybody was working a lot. Everybody was like, didn't have a lot of time to plan. We like, Griff had a game that had sort of like sputtered out, and like,
and I think you specifically had clocked something, which was, like, I was doing Aridane, and that was all I had bandwidth for. But I was also bartending at the time.
Yeah.
So I was working, but I did have, like, I would have a crazy shift and then a day free where I could do prep stuff for Aridane. Griffin and Connor, who were our roommates at the time, we were living on Gold Street in New York. Gold Street. They were working more full time, and I think had these huge campaign settings. Griff was trying to do this thing called Mirakenth for a little while, and Connor was doing Terra. And the lore of these worlds were massive. They were big, epic worlds. And I think you and I were both watching Griffin and Connor take this tremendous load on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think you specifically clocked it and were like, no. I am not.
I'm going to bite a really small... So it was like, I think, like a direct reaction to that was like, okay, we all want to play. I didn't have a lot of like time and energy to like build a big, complicated campaign setting like that. So like sort of a founding thing. I think I said like leading this game was like, hey, I'm not going to put a huge amount of work into this. This is going to be our casual game, and like. I sort of asked of the players, like, I'm not always going to give you like an adventure hook or like a or whatever. And so the game ended up being like, at least the way I conceived it was sort of like a dark fantasy survival, like wilderness survival elements to it, where like there wasn't a lot of education, and there was this big empire that had recently fallen. And basically, it was like the world was these settlements that were sort of scattered and isolated. I leaned into doing something that, like, I think in the past, neither you and I had really like done a lot of, which is like had a bunch of random encounter tables and like a bunch of random stuff in the woods, and like I had a map that sort of like whenever I was out and doing something and I would have an idea, I would write down like, okay, here's an idea for something people could run into on this map. And then also I just went online and I borrowed a bunch of like towns and dungeons and like anything. There's all kinds of like published adventures, which I always found more work to run than just making up our own stuff. And just grabbed sort of the map from here and like some creatures from over here and said like, okay, they're like, that's here in the world and that's over there in the world. And it sort of led to like, I think what was kind of cool about that game is, again, sort of a reaction to like, I didn't want to run a game that was, I wanted to fight sort of my own urge that I had noticed of like being railroady in my games. So I just had a bunch of tables and they were what they were. And I led also with like, hey, I'm not going to change these encounters to be good encounters for everybody. Like, it's a dangerous woods. I know what's in the woods, and I'm gonna roll to see what you run into, and that's it. Like,
it was so freeing when you introduced that campaign, and I remember the attitude that you took with it. And I want to say something here which is very funny at the time. Some of our friends had bigger, more ambitious campaigns that they wanted to run more frequently. Because I was running a big, ambitious, epic, deeply world-designed campaign. But that's easy to do when you're only playing once every 2 months. Like, I would have 2 months to squeeze downtime in to prep the next session. For everyone else, like you know, our friends who were trying to run like weekly games or bi-weekly games that wanted that depth of lore building and deep campaign hooks, we sort of watched them. We'd get like a couple sessions in, and it would be like, guys, I need more time to prep the next session, and that becomes 2 weeks, and then 4, and then 6, and then the campaign fizzles.
Right.
And you came along and were like, guys, I'm not going to do prep work if I don't have time. This is going to be our casual fun game. And I remember part of me, as an epic world builder, I was like, you're not allowed to say that. Where's your 20 pages of history, you plebeian? You know, like, I was like, this is scandalous. And then, of course, you started running a regular game. And because of you set up, like, there's history in this world. Your fucking bumpkin characters in this fallen empire don't know it. And the infrastructure of magocratic, you know, wizard empire has fallen. So all the fucking magitech that this place ran on is gone. And now goblins have emerged from their warrens deep under the earth. And this is an extinction event. You're in basically what's like almost like the flavor of a zombie survival horror, but with goblins. And the whole attitude of it was like, hey, you are not 6 chosen ones. You're a group of people trying to not get killed by goblins.
Yeah.
And It was so fucking fun right away. But what I love about it, and this is, I think, a huge lesson for people at home I think the lessons to take away from Goblin Trouble, for me at least, were go to your players and tell them what your situation is. Mm-hmm. Be like, guys, I don't have a lot of prep time. I'm working a full-time job. Great. It set our expectations. Go forward and say, this is the type of campaign this is. We're doing survival horror. Mm-hmm. Not only survival horror, but also a lot of weird body horror stuff.
There ended up being a lot of weird... Well, because of the way I was doing the game, anytime I sort of had an idea, it just like went into the world somewhere. I added it to my list of random things, and like... there was a chance you'd run into it. And it ended up, you ran into all this like mutation stuff, and you found out like the goblins in this world were actually mutated, like I think they're mutated halflings from like ages long past, like and it was possible for other people to like gain these mutations and stuff. Like, it got weird.
Yeah,
it was cool.
It was a extremely Jack Covell setting, in that it was that type of monster. It's a fucked up type of this other creature. Where we fought some horrifying goblin Etten in a past that was like regenerating.
That was a really good example, actually, because that was specifically way above your level at the time. Like, there was this town that was being blockaded, and these two huge goblinoid creatures that were like, again, it was, I stole like the stat blocks from other creatures, but they were like these huge like malformed goblinoid things, way above your challenge rating, like by the stats of the game. But I remember, like, because you sort of scouted it out and you knew that like this might not be a balanced encounter, these things are actually really scary, and if they hit us once, they'll probably kill us. Meant that like you did the whole like climbed onto the ridge above them and like knocked one into the sea to fight the sea serpent that you knew was there. Like,
it was extremely well done, and it made to me the narrative skill of a dungeon master is the only thing a dungeon master is trying to do, because the PCs are telling the story. They're the main characters.
Yeah.
Your job as a dungeon master is to create mood. And to the degree that you were able to do that in Goblin Trouble, or sorry, I should say, the degree you were able to do that in Goblin Trouble was profound, because because of tools both in character and out of character. Out of character, you were like, hey guys, it's these fucking tables. I'm not taking it easy on you. This is how dangerous the world is. So we ran into a black dragon, and there was this immediate thing. There wasn't this thing of like, we're chosen ones. This is part of the adventure. And Jack would never, like, that attitude of like, God never gives you a problem you can't handle. No, he can and will. Like,
oh yeah.
This God is not even cruel. This God is relying on randomized monster tables, even worse than cruel.
Like, and even like, it ended up being fun for me to run that game in a way I wasn't really expecting, where it was like, I knew the things that you could run into, but it was just as much a surprise to me of like I wonder what's going to happen this time. Like, I know all of this like crazy, creepy, scary stuff. I know all this weird stuff that can happen in this world, and I don't know what's going to happen. Like, it was that made it really fun for me to run that game too.
It was so fun to be in that game with all the horror stuff, and then also like our characters bonding. I love my character Gyalfi is this like lawful evil giant enforcer. Was so fun. We played with our friends Quinn and Griffin was like the wizard in that campaign. Mm-hmm. We had lots. I became a mute. You gave me a cursed weapon. I had this cursed axe, and I remember that you kept saying like, as you swing this, you're rolling Constitution saving throws, you're rolling Dexterity saving throws, and I kept going like, it's such a good fucking axe. It didn't even have a mind control. It was just like
it was just a very powerful. It like healed you every time you hit with it. Like,
a lot. It was one of these things where, honestly, in my mind, is a better mechanic for cursed items than like make a wisdom saving throw. It controls your mind. It's like, here's something so fucking broken that it's going to be impossible for you, the player, to not want to use it. And I fucked up one of my saving throws and became a mutant, and like crystals grew out of my body and my head sunk into my chest, and like it was like stark and terrifying.
And I remember that was kind of cool too, because it was it like narratively felt like a heartbreaking random chance thing, because you were kind of on this journey to be like like a tyrannical leader, but something of a leader to these other giants. The giants were sort of these like, they were the soldiers of the old empire, and they were sort of scattered around. But then you becoming a mutant made it this like heartbreaking, like maybe you would have been the chosen one, but instead you've turned into this monster. Like, and the other giants, their reaction to you and stuff.
They're like, reacting like I'm a freak, and it was like, it was really heartbreaking. And but again, this attitude of the game of you, I think there's a tremendous amount of commendable work there of you being like, here's my bandwidth, I'm gonna crib maps and stuff from the internet, and I'm gonna like use these random tables. This is what we're gonna do. And what you ended up producing in this thing that was almost like an act of humility as a dungeon master, being like, here's my bandwidth, here's what I can do, is you played a regular game, which for any DM is a fucking feat. To be able to like regularly play. We got to like some high level, I think, right? I forget what we got.
I mean, we got like 7th or 8th level,
somewhere around there,
which is pretty good.
That's, like, it's really decent.
I think another thing that that I think really worked about that game was like when I first started that game, I was a little self-conscious about like just taking a bunch of stuff from published adventures and like repurposing it. But it was like kind of like, let's like give it a shot. Like, sorry, I don't know. And it ended up being just really helpful. And it was like the tiniest bit of like a change of like the circumstances, the change of the setting meant that like, cool, this like published dungeon is now a ruin. It's like maybe it's a temple in like the published dungeon. It was really easy for me to look at that and be like, okay, this was a temple, now it's overgrown or something. Like,
and exactly, like you cribbing stuff and making your life easier rather than hard. In other words, you looking at this societal image of a game master we have, of this like long-suffering noblesse oblige, like I prep and slave away for my players, and the long hours have, and you were like, fuck that, and ended up producing something of a higher quality than almost any of the games I've played in.
Oh, shucks.
But truly, it was so, and what I love too is, and this is, I think, a really great lesson for DMs that are daunted by workload, is by the time we had played 10, 15, 20 sessions in that world, the world building of Goblin Trouble was not even as richer than a lot of other campaigns. Because guess what? World building happens at its best at the table. Like, by the final sessions, we had learned a lot of stuff. Even though you had been like, I'm not doing a lot of prep, we're not doing a big info dump, you're in a settlement, goblins are here, we're starting. By the end, we had found this weird submerged alien spacecraft. There was like weird stuff with like golem robots. We were learning more about the ancient wizard empire. We found like, because there were like artifacts that hinted at this world. And what you did a clever thing of being like, I don't want to spend a lot of time prepping this, but as things come up, I will, of course, use them to explain things in the background of the world. And just you improvising through player character backstory, the lore of magical items we found, and the motivations of enemies we were finding, this rich world background became constructed in the negative space of the little information we did have, which was honestly so cool to build your campaign's backstory through how we were piecing information together.
Yeah, it was really fun for me too, because it was like I said, it was like I didn't know how that was gonna happen. It wasn't me explaining stuff. It was me like having ideas and putting it in the world and stuff like that. The other thing I wanted to like highlight about that was like a big thing starting that game was I felt like I was asking a lot of the players. Like I was specifically like, hey guys, I'm not going to be able to carry this game. Like I'm not going to be able to keep it. I'm not going to try to keep this exciting. I'm going to run the world. Like it's up to you to figure out your own motivations, to interact with each other, to like to play your character and decide your own goals. And like I think that's one of the reasons that game worked so well, was that like everybody was willing as players to be like, okay, nobody's going to make this exciting for me. I'm here to like play an adventure with people, and it was not me like taking you on a journey. It was me just being like, hey, I'm a backdrop, like play your characters. I knew that because we were all good friends and we'd play D&D, that it would be fun to play together. And I felt a lot like I was sort of relying on that of like we know and have fun playing our characters together, and sort of letting that happen would be fun without sort of the workload on my part.
There's a lot of trust you have to have in your players to be able to say, like, you guys are going to run, you guys are the engine of this, not me.
Yeah.
I'm the body, I'm everything else going, I'll make the world happen.
Yeah.
But you guys, and I think looking on that as a player, of course, nothing is more gratifying as a player, to me at least, than being like, the adventure we're on was our idea.
Yeah.
Like,
it ended up being really cool where, like, by the end of that game, I feel like if we had kept playing it, it was changing from a survival horror type of game to kind of an empire building game. Like, the progression of sort of like, oh, we're surviving out here. You sort of you played a big part in like breaking this blockade of a town, and then sort of like went into this position of leadership there and started taking over, and like you were this lawful evil giant, and it was sort of like the beginnings of like tyranny, and like these people need someone to take charge to survive. Like, it was
really
cool.
Crazy lesson in the psychology of why do people turn to lawful evil people for answers. And it's like, in the situation where we had all these chaotic evil goblins running around, and this like wizard and his like giant enforcer show up and be like, we are strong enough to keep you safe. Submit to our rule and we will stop the goblins. And a bunch of farmers being like, yep, we'll do it. Okay.
Yeah.
And you go like, oh shit. And there was a lot of scary lessons in that, and in a good way, of like examining the psychology of how and why people submit to the rule of wicked people. Because it's like, hey, you hate goblins, don't you? Well, as long as you do everything we say and never step out of line, we'll keep you safe from the goblins. And it was creepy, but it was very, I don't know, illuminating to play. But again, I think that it's like, to your credit as a dungeon master, and I think that's something that requires empathy. If you're playing with brand new players, they might want a wizard to show up and say, there are demons at the edge of town. You must find the soul stone. And they go, got it, right? But there's that attitude, and I think it comes from a huge LARPing background, because we were both at Wayfinder for a long time doing our LARPing thing. I remember the first time I was like 15 playing a game and realizing that my leader had died. I had a magical artifact that the entire fate of the world depended on, and something broke in my brain, and I went, no one's going to tell you what to do. You just have to do something. And I think there is a moment of experience that players get to. That experience can come from role-playing games, or it can come from something else, theater, creative writing, whatever. But there's a level of experience people will get to where suddenly the balance shifts, and railroads and having a thing you're supposed to be doing becomes less fun than you going like, hey, this world is like our world in that you need to answer the question of what am I supposed to be doing for yourself.
Yeah. That's actually like the that experience of like, oh, I have agency here and there are repercussions for my actions. I mean, that's honestly something I like about working in the video game industry now, is like, games as a medium is all about sort of like, if you have agency in a narrative, it allows sort of the repercussions for that agency to feel a lot more personal. And like, D&D is a great game for that, because it is like, you can choose to do whatever you want, and it's sort of like, the game to me is really like cool and fulfilling and growth inspiring when like the repercussions for those actions are like seen and felt, and you see kind of what it's like to to make choices like that.
Yeah, to simulate your to feel that degree of agency is intoxicating. And I think that there is an element as well of like when you're on railroads, the challenges are, does the train keep going or does it stop?
Yeah.
You know, like it's monodirectional. And so when you're playing in railroads, again, for new players, I recommend railroads. It's when you're dealing with the game system and pretending to be somebody, sometimes it's nice just to be like, okay, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and my agency is like, which of my abilities I use in this fight, or like it's really, you're boxed in, and that can feel comforting. But I remember in Goblin Trouble that idea of like, okay, we've survived this goblin attack, but this town's destroyed. We can't stay here. Well, we heard about a town to the north of here that rumor said was doing better. That's not an adventure hook. That is just you being like, here's the only thing.
Yeah.
Like we can go west to this town that we like. I remember there's one great thing that happened. We were in a town on a crossroads, and you literally said something along the lines of like, you know the Goblin Horde is headed west of here. You've heard a rumor that the town to the west of here is doing really well. There's a town to the north of here that has survived a couple of goblin attacks. There are 2 roads going south and east. You don't know where they go. And so we're sitting there in this ruins, like bloodied and kind of survived, and we're like, okay, here's our information. East, ? South, ? West, doing okay, but we know that it's not going to be doing okay for long.
And it's also like the goblins went that way, so I don't know if we also want to go that way.
Do we also want to go that way? Because, you know, do we find a city under siege? Like, literally, you being like, you have incomplete information and you still need to make a choice, which was like the most, weirdly, there's more agency as a character when you're like, I only have bad information.
Yeah. And that also, by the way, that was so fun for me because I knew what was down, I knew what was like to the south and to the east. And like, I sort of knew, I had concrete ideas about like what you would find in these places, but it was kind of really cool to be like, ooh, I wonder which one they're gonna go to. Like, ooh, I could go anywhere.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's
cool.
It was really, really fun. I love Goblin Trouble. We'll move over to some audience questions now. If you're watching this, you could have been watching it 2 weeks earlier. If you were signed up for Dropout, go sign up for Dropout, and you can see Adventuring Academy earlier, a whole bunch of other great content, Dimension 20, you got to check it out. Also, all of our questions are submitted on our Dropout exclusive Discord server. So if you want to ask questions, you got to get on the Discord. This is from Shield9. Thanks, Shield9.
Thanks, Shield9.
How do you create an original universe that is different from past creations of yours? I feel like I'm inhibited creatively as I'm too attached to characters and universes to just let them go. This is a great question. Jack and I have a lot of experience with this, both having run multiple tabletop campaign settings and also having run multiple, I would say, we did a lot of LARPs. We were both LARP writers.
Yeah. I think my initial reaction to that is kind of like, I never want to run the same thing again, because I can sort of relate to that as like, oh, I did a high fantasy game. I'll do another high fantasy game, but I really like the stuff from the first high fantasy game that I did. So like, what am I going to, I get it from that perspective. And like my kind of reaction is like, I wouldn't do the same thing again. Like there's a game that I'm right now is sort of like putting together that we should start playing pretty soon.
Hell yeah,
of like the Western fantasy, like like cowboys and gunslingers and stuff fantasy. And that's like, it's not at all like this dark fantasy survival thing like Goblin Trouble was, and it's not at all like the like I ran this like apocalyptic fantasy game before that. And like, because it's sort of a different theme, number one, it's sort of like exciting to be like, okay, like this is something different. And it also feels like I'm not tempted to reuse or like, hold on to the stuff from those other settings, because this is really trying to do something else entirely. Like, yeah.
I love that. Well, what I love too about that is I think that, how do I put this? you've created a lot of worlds that were really. Goblin Trouble was extremely different from like. Remember Sid? We played for a little while. Sid was a druidic apocalypse.
Yeah.
Basically, like a bunch of druid. There was a highly civilized world, and a group of druids.
It was kind of like a Gormenghast. Like
Yes.
everywhere it was super overpopulated. Like everywhere was cities. It was like high fantasy, but it was still like
All cities,
all urban.
And this cabal of druids like did like a 10th level spell and forcefully returned the world to wilderness by having like an Yggdrasil tree just like crack the world in half and like take over. And it was. That's a very different campaign setting from like Walking on Sunshine that we worked on together, which was your insane pulp time travel game. But what's interesting is stylistically, I can connect all of those games. It's almost, I don't know, it's like a directorial style. Like you can watch 5 seconds of a movie and know that it's a Coen Brothers movie or know that it's a Wes Anderson movie. Your games, tabletop or LARP, have a strong style to them, even though you didn't repeat yourself in terms of themes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I think that makes sense to hear because I think I actually kind of think about that. Like I get excited about doing new stuff when it is like I start with the theme.
Yeah.
Like the reason I'm sort of putting together this Western game is I was thinking like, oh, like I've seen like Victorian fantasy with magic and stuff. I've seen like medieval fantasy and modern day fantasy, but I haven't seen a lot of like Western, like Western fantasy.
Yeah.
And I just kind of like wanted to explore that. That's kind of a new thing to do.
I love that, and I think that's good. Like to the user's question, like having elements of your style that keep cropping up, I think is good. Like it's not wrong to have areas of interest and focus as a DM. I think it's just about like being able to tell new stories in the same style, right? And I think that's a fun thing to be able to do. I also think it's interesting too, talking about style real quickly, because Jack, you are, in addition to being a writer, you're also a visual artist, and I think that often gets passed over a lot in terms of its importance. Like when I think of how much I loved the Planescape setting back in 2nd edition D&D. Tony DiTerlizzi is the reason that Planescape was so good. I mean, amongst great design and great writers as well, but like having because so much of the experience at the table is about mood and style, I feel like the visuals of like compelling art, and I think also you see the reason that part of D&D's huge resurgence in this era has to do with the incredible thriving fan art community that exists and people sharing art of these things. Do you think, D&D is words shared at a table, but I still think the visual component of the game, even if it's only in your mind's eye, is a hugely critical component. We have a little secret Eridane group that we're all a part of, and a lot of what we do in that group is share visual like reference art as like inspo for the world. When you're designing games, obviously you work as a character artist, but when you're designing your own tabletop or LARP games, what part does visual art play in that process for you?
I mean, I think I sort of think very visually about this sort of creative stuff, and like I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. Like I haven't really thought too much about that. I guess it is like a big sort of imagining the fantasy world in my head, playing D&D for all of these years, is like the same skill as sort of like imagining what like a character in the video game is going to look like, and sort of like like I've always found, I've told you this before, but like your style of DMing is like you do very vivid like visual descriptions that are super evocative of like seeing something in my head, even though like the actually sort of making a visual art is like less your specialization. It's a very interesting thing, because I feel like
visuals are hugely important to me because it's all about setting a scene and immersion, making your players feel like they're really there.
Yeah.
And so much of fantasy is that fantasia, like I'm seeing something I've never seen before. I remember the scene, particularly, there was actually a scene where you were like, Brennan, if if this comedy thing doesn't work out, you should be like an art director.
Yeah.
We were doing a scene set in the realms of myth, and there was this desert where these sand dunes were being moved by wind, and I was narrating that as the dunes were moving through this like windswept area, they were changing color, but the sand was changing color as though there were actual clearly bordered areas of space where, like, as soon as the dune moves into this area, the top becomes bright red as the middle is orange and the bottom is blue on like crisp lines of sand, as though these areas in space are making it these colors. And as the dunes move, they shift, and the sand is moving, but the areas where the color stays that way are static.
Yeah. Like that's such a cool visual. I want to see that in something, that's, I mean, it also makes me kind of think of like, a thing that I kind of learned about myself in school was like, when I was doing, early, I transferred, changed majors like a million times in school. But when I was doing fine art stuff, where the point of the art was more about like, oh, what are you trying to say with your visual art? It actually made me sort of realize like my interest in visual arts is like as it's tied to narrative. I like sort of like character design as a way of like saying something about a character, and I like visual art that to me inspires kind of a story in my head, or like a piece of art that I see and it like I can sort of imagine what else is like outside of the frame, and that is sort of the same thing as kind of we're talking about of like visual arts as it's tied to narrative is to me like really closely linked, because that's like why I like making art, is like to try to tell a story visually.
I think that's beautiful, and I think it's a great way for people to conceive their campaigns as well, because every campaign you've run was dominated by these strong visuals. Like Goblin Trouble had all this mutation and weird body horror stuff. Sid was like, part of our adventure was in a forest growing on the branch of a world tree, and we only realized that we were like miles in the sky some like weeks after journeying across. Like everything was dominated by these truly like awesome surreal fantasy visuals, and it was, I feel like, communicated stuff that would have been harder to communicate dryly through like you're saying, like if I give you an image of this moment or this scene or this character, I can communicate so much more information than if I tried to word by word piece together a description of them. Yeah. Right.
I think that's like, it's kind of an interesting thing of like when I take a minute to sort of self-reflect on my own, like how I like to run games and sort of my strengths and weaknesses as a DM. It's like I like running games that sort of like evoke a feeling of being in a place. So like visuals and like I try to make a point to like describe what it like smells like and it feels like, and like it's like I feel like my games like they're carried by like that and all the voices. Yeah. Whereas like I think your games are like these like beautiful intricate narrative things, which like for me is a lot harder to do, but it just means that our games have a very different kind of like we're both leaning into our strengths as like this is what kind of comes naturally to us trying to run these games.
I think that's beautiful. And I think that like, so again, to the question, like relying on a style is not a bad thing. I think you should always try to tell new stories, but having style and having things that work for you and tools that you like to come back to, this is a weird analogy, see if you can follow this. It's okay to keep coming back to the same tools over and over as long as you're using them to build different things. That's how I would put that.
Yeah, very, very well put.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This next question is from Rhythmica. Thanks, Rhythmica. I've been DMing for about a year, and I've noticed a problem. I can't seem to let my players die. They keep putting themselves in situations where death is certain, and I always bail them out. How can I let myself be the bad guy and let their characters die? Whoa. Jack.
How to kill characters. Well, I think the first thing is like if I wouldn't say there's necessarily something wrong with having a game where like the risk of death is not a big part of sort of the type of game you're trying to run.
Yeah.
That's not necessary. Like, I don't think there's any reason for sort of an external judgment on that. It does sort of undercut some of the stakes of conflict and stuff. Like, I think one of the reasons that, I mean, this is sort of a grander statement, but I think like the reasons that like violence comes up so much in the narratives of D&D is like, it's sort of like the ultimate high stakes where like, character death is sort of like the ultimate highest stakes. So it's very exciting to sort of risk that. I don't know what to say other than just like, you got to do it.
You got to kill them.
And I think it's also important to be like, you don't kill them. Just listen to like, I think the strength of D&D as opposed to, I remember when we were younger, we played like freeform role playing where everybody just said what their characters did and decided sort of like, there was no dice rolling. And like, I think to me, the real thing that the dice and like the stats in your character sheet add to those games is a concreteness outside of someone deciding something. So like, it's not the DM deciding whether you're going to live or die. It's like, I think Goblin Trouble, I really leaned into this where it was like, I'm just sort of arbitrating like, there is this creature here. This creature has these concrete stats and it has like, there are rule systems to determine if this creature grabs you and crushes you or if you dodge out of the way. And like, I think the thing that's really bringing to these games for me is like, is those stakes. It's sort of like there is a concreteness to the world outside of the DM just deciding something. And like, that makes the stakes high. That makes it scary when somebody like I remember lots of times in Eridan, I feel like that's kind of the attitude that you go into these like high stakes encounters, especially at really high levels where you can sort of
insta kill, you know.
It's a lot. I think it's riskier at low level to be like, whoops, you're killed.
We played like a week and a half ago. M's character almost died.
So close.
But for the indomitability spell, it was a death effect. It was
really close. And that like the stakes were high because it was like you went into that being like, okay, in the setting of this world, these are like the spirits and creatures living in this place. And like even though it was a way more sort of like beautifully built narrative up to this moment, in like the moment of conflict, you sort of give up and be like, hey, I built what this situation is, and it's not really up to you like whether someone lives or dies. That's the part where the rule system is like.
I think that's a great point. I think as a DM, if you're feeling really sad and scared about pulling the trigger, say that to your PCs. And I think what you can, I think in Eridan, even in the past couple of years, I've gotten better about being like, almost like battle is starting. I don't know what's going to happen. This isn't me making these calls anymore. Like, I made the calls about who your enemies were. You guys made some calls about how you were going to treat them. Some shit went down in some role-playing stuff. We've all rolled initiative now. Now we don't know.
Yeah. And I remember even, like, in those situations, you're kind of on, like, our side. Like, you'll be like, hey, I'm sorry, you've got to roll a saving throw and like please roll high. Like
please roll high.
Or stuff like rolling attack rolls for these, like you're kind of on our side where you roll things out in the open. It's like, hey, this character is like blasting you with a bunch of magic. I got to roll a lot of dice now. Like Like, fingers crossed.
Truly,
I'm rooting for you. You know?
Truly, in terms of like speaking in internet memes for a second, the biggest big DM mood of all is the scene in Aladdin where the genie's been taken by Jafar and he holds the thing over his eyes and does the finger gun to do this. I can't look while I do it. That is the biggest DM mood of all time. But I remember, I rolled, like, we had a scene that we played in this game a little while ago, which was like 10 years in the making. When we were all just like out of college, M's character, Ippolito, sold his soul to luck and destiny. And they were like, on your 16th birthday, we're going to come and collect. Mm-hmm. And then M, this last time, they had to roll a bunch of incredible rolls. It was a scene 10 years in the making to bamboozle and hoodwink and flim-flam luck and destiny themselves.
And we were all like at the table, like M was there and they were rolling like, okay, rolling a bluff for Ippolito. Like, I hope I roll okay because
I've been planning this for 10 years.
If they catch me in this lie, my soul is like forfeit or something. Like, it's bad.
And it actually fucking worked. And as these rolls came up, we were exploding from the table and screaming because it was like these 6 or 7 rolls in a row that determined the fate of this character's soul. Mm-hmm. And here's the issue. You can play a game where it's explicit between you and your players that death is not on the table. That's okay. You can all say like, hey, no one is here at this table to watch their character die. I think that's okay. Mm-hmm. The issue is for other players, and I think this includes us and Aridane, we know that we don't get the table exploding nat 20s. We don't get the moments of, I can't believe it, unless we know that death is an option. And
the other thing I would say is like sort of my longest running character, Exonimus in Aridane, he died for a long time.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to you like, hey, the game isn't as fun for me not playing Exonimus.
Yeah.
And like, that was just true. I like really liked that there was something about that character that was kind of unique to me.
Yeah.
I remember like I often gravitate towards like these like sneaky or like spellcasting characters, and Exonimus was just sort of like a big brute, sort of like trying to find his definition for right and wrong, and basically I played a bunch of tricksy characters, and then I played a kind of stupid character, and it was so liberating and cool. But like in that situation, we did kind of work together to be like, okay, well, like death is a really permanent thing in this setting, so like we don't want to undercut sort of the gravity of that. But, you know, we're also still playing a fun game together, and we kind of worked, I remember we had some conversations about kind of like, okay, well, like, how can the narrative be steered slightly in a way for me to play, like, a version or a part of that character, or, like...
Yeah.
And that felt very sort of collaborative on us, because I feel like I can be a very emotional D&D player, where I was like... it was like really hard when that character died. Like,
well, and I think it's telling too. And I want to talk a lot about like this question has to be answered differently for each and every campaign. Because let me be clear. It was a big deal when Exonimus died. Mm-hmm. The campaign we played prior to that, Storm City, you were hurling your characters into death non-stop.
Dude, that was the character I had like become an NPC because he had like been driven mad and stuff.
You had a character get like shredded by a weird psychic engine and turned into a thought monster.
Yep.
It was the point is this. I remember characters that you played because Storm City was this sprawling noir intrigue, like urban fantasy, like urban high fantasy game where everyone was playing like 3 or 4 PCs at the same time. So you were playing PCs where you're like, my name is like Laszlo Jones. I have a death wish. And like truly, or
well, like that was Laszlo Jones was a tragic story, and he started as he's an elf who like chopped his own ears off to look like a human in this like human centric city. He was like trying to be a knight, but also was getting hungry and like robbed people. Like it really like not a good guy.
A deeply cowardly, self-loathing person.
Incredibly so cowardly that he was driven mad eventually by like
and
his
I remember
fear.
in the thing of that setting, everyone was playing so many characters, which is I think a good thing. If you want to make death a big part of your campaign, talk about what people's replacement characters will be. Because I think as a DM, you owe that. If you're going to be like, hey, this game's hyper lethal, don't wait until someone's lost their only key into the game to talk about what playing another character will look like, I think. But, in Storm City, there were so many characters running around that, honestly, for everyone, it felt like they were playing multiple NPCs. So you guys were real laissez-faire about these people fucking like, I'm just fucking getting axed left and right.
I still remember the first time two of Connor's characters, I think, met each other. And then he just had a conversation being the two characters.
We sent him into a corner to talk to himself.
Go talk to yourself. And he did.
He did. Yeah, I think he had sock puppets. But that was true. And I remember his characters, the same character died twice in the same way. But then we got into Aridane, and it was because Aridane has been such an epic arc following these specific people. And Exonomus was not even the first person to die. Connor's character was the first person to die. Owen, the Hobbit Prince, died.
Yeah.
And your character died in the same setting where his character was finally resurrected. Because I was basically very clear of like, look, death is huge and permanent here. And if you want to resurrect somebody, that's not like a 7th level spell or whatever. That is unique, miraculous magic. And you guys spent 4 years of real lifetime adventuring to get Owen back. And I, as a DM, was like, cool. Owen is a messiah and prophet to his people. This party's sorcerer is bending all of his arcane will to bringing his friend back. I'll let this be a one-off miracle. And literally, it's like founded a religion. I don't know if you guys know this, but resurrection tends to found religions in real life, and so it stands to reason that wouldn't be like like a small deal.
No big deal. Somebody came back from the dead.
And then Exonomus died, and it was a very similar thing narratively, where I was like, look, I only allowed a resurrection to happen because this other guy was literally like a prophet. And we talked about it for Exonomus, and so by the time Exonomus died, we knew that death was on the table. A PC had already died.
Yeah.
And the way the scene played out, it was like incredibly heartbreaking. Like Nick Marini tried to save your life. He was 1 away from doing it. He rolled a 19 when he needed a 20. And it was this, but I remember the whole way of it working out was like, it was a couple rounds. It was not a surprise insta-kill. You were petrified. And then there were 1 or 2 rounds where it was, in other words, I think to the person who asked if you're a DM, put it more in the dice's hands. Like in that instance, I was like, okay, death is on its way. You guys have 2 rounds. Griffin opened that book of magic and had to roll and like rolled bad. He's like he passed out from like the arcane power of this thing. There were a couple ways out of that. It wasn't just you. It wasn't just me. It was like us, the dice, other people's actions, and we all watched this thing happen.
Yeah.
And but it ended up in the story now where Exonomus has come back as this demigod, which again took years of real life adventuring and ended up with one of my favorite adventure arcs of the thing, which was meeting the 2 halves of Exonomus's fractured soul. And like, I don't know. I think that death is not the end. In all of these worlds, the afterlife are like real places. Resurrection is not the only answer. In Exonomus's case, his time in this plane is limited. He's a demigod.
Yeah. And he was like he came back as a spirit, that it was like a twisted part of him. And he was another, like the other part of him was separate. And like he never came back to life. But like there were elements of him that continued as kind of new and different characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I was going to say is that I just thought of at thinking about Wayfinder of our like history at LARP camp. It's not necessarily heartbreaking to have your character die. Sometimes it's really fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really fun to be like, oh, wow, my character's dead. I guess I'm a new character now. Like, that's exciting. And it's, I think there's something special to the end of a character's arc, whether that's like the chosen one, like saving the world. That's an end of a character arc. But also the end of a character arc is like someone who could have been great tragically, through a fluke of luck or one bad decision or something, like is killed and their story is cut short, is like, that's kind of a beautiful end to a character also. Like,
I can't imagine Aridane as a story without Owen and Exonimus's death. Like the scene that like you and Nick Marini had in Death when Nick like apologized for not being able to save Exonimus. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of role playing I've ever seen. I think that if you're telling a story of epic high fantasy includes death in its storytelling. Mm-hmm. Death doesn't have to be a part of every story, but it might have to be a part of every epic fantasy story. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or stories about swords and magic and battle and war. That's a part of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you can do are the simple practical things you can do is talk to your players. If you're reluctant as a DM, talk to them about that and be like, hey, I'm reluctant to pull the trigger. Set up circumstances where you're rolling in front of the board. The death saves mechanic in 5e is a great mechanic for it because, they drop to 0. And then it really is up to the dice. It's like a 50-50 or slightly better than 50-50 chance. Mm-hmm. Like, you as a DM can surrender it to the dice. And then I think also there's an element there where you have to, like Jack was saying, at a certain point just take the jump because because the game starts paying a price in other ways. Of course, in the moment, there's a part of you saying, well, just don't kill them, save them somehow, bail, don't let the character die. Of course you're going to feel that because you're a feeling human being. And of course, I'm my PC's biggest fan. I never want them to go. But the price gets paid elsewhere if you bail them out. And every nat 20 is diminished. Every success in the face of danger is diminished. You take the shine off every other combat and every other risk in that style of storytelling. In violent, epic fantasy storytelling, the shine comes off of everything when the threat of death goes away.
Yeah, unfortunate. I mean, the other thing that, and we're really like going on about this question, but it's a really good question. It's a
really good question, yeah.
The other thing that I would say is, like, in my experience playing with you, it's like something I really like is sort of like in Exonimus's case. He failed. I rolled like a 1 on a saving throw and got turned to ice. And then there was like these 2 rounds of like, hey, everyone can try stuff, and everybody like almost rolled enough, but not quite. And then that was it. Like, but it wasn't like I fail my saving throw and my character's dead. Because I remember, in the style of game that you're running with Aridane, it is this big epic story, and it is a big deal to die. So there were kind of like a lot of chances to make it, and it just barely missed all of them, which made it like no one's character died offhand.
Yes,
people's characters died in like tragic ways. And
I will say this too, like the person that killed Exonimus was the main villain of the campaign.
Yeah.
In the confrontation where they were revealed. Narrative, and they said something so horrendously evil and revealed something so awful, and Jack was playing this lawful good character that surprised the shit out of me by launching an attack on them. It was like not even a verbal response. Like, they say that, I attack. And I remember in my head being like, oh no, Jack, because I knew that the dude was secretly this like villainous demigod abomination, and you guys were 8th level, and it was a thing where you did something in character that still surprised me. And then I went like, as a DM, I backed myself into a corner. I was like, this guy's an evil demigod of death. Jack's just taking a swing at him because your character was broken to bits. You actually bypassed his damage reduction and hurt him.
Smashed him.
So it wasn't the thing where he could just like knock you back. You hurt him. He was hurt. Yeah. And I went like, oh no. And I was like, okay, roll initiative. And then all of us were at the mercy of the dice. But I think, to answer your question, if you're reluctant as a DM, yeah, if you're playing the type of story that's so epic that characters narratively shouldn't die unless it's a big deal, you can, the character Harfang, the villain there, didn't do not everything he did in that fight. He did a lot of stuff for show in that fight.
Yeah.
He turned you to ice. He didn't like scramble to run up and smash you as soon as possible. He did a big villainous thing. It's a big epic campaign. And everyone had 2 rounds to try stuff as he slowly strode towards you, picked you up over his head, and then destroyed you. Which I think as a DM is me being like, this is big and villainous. He's gloating. It's in character for him. Also, if Exonimus dies, we'll all know that it was not only the story, but an incredible show of poor fortune on the part of the dice. And I think when it happened, all of us went like, there were a lot of off-ramps for this not to happen, and narratively it makes sense. And it's heartbreaking, and it affected the story literally for years to come up until this point.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also a really good example of like, you knew who Harfang really was. I made a character choice to be like, I'm gonna unexpectedly attack this person for saying, which was actually a really like pivotal character moment. Because Exonimus, like up until this point, what really struggled with sort of like the moment to take action, like when you know if something is right or wrong, and like being paralyzed by like making the wrong mistake, like in this decisive moment of like, this is a time to employ like violence. This is like, this crosses the line and I make a decisive choice. It was very decisive for the character, and it revealed sort of the truth of Harfang, that it was like, this is a big scary thing, and like you knew that, and I didn't, and we all found out.
I just realized that if Exonimus hadn't have done that, you guys never would have found out Harfang's true nature.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Holy shit! I'd never even realized. I mean, because obviously that session was dominated by Exonimus's death, but yeah, that action on Exonimus gave everybody that bit of incredibly secret information. I don't know, as a DM, I just really put that together myself.
And there's definitely an element of that I remember at the time, honestly kind of hurt my feelings, where I was like, well, we didn't know that he was this big scary guy. But I think the truth of it was like, yeah, my character didn't know either. This is not like, it felt very specifically like not a handholdy moment of like, you weren't just telling us a story. Like you knew that this was like a really big, scary guy. And we had hints that there was more to this guy than like what we knew. Not to the extent that ended up being true, but like that's sort of what happens when you take that risk. And it was like, and then from there it was, I played some different characters, and I like, eventually came back as like the twisted, vengeful ghost of Exonimus, and then like it was definitely a pivotal part in his whole story.
Yeah. And what I love now Exonimus is back and you're playing our sweet, good lion boy again. And all of the characters you played in the interim are now in other parts of the campaign world being extremely helpful. So it's almost like you backdoored your way into giving your party a bunch of extra cohorts. like an extremely powerful alchemist and a bunch of other people. God, that's beautiful. So yes, death is huge. It's a big deal. I think it's important for the narrative of your world. If you're telling that kind of story, you should keep it. But of course, treat it with the deference it deserves. Oh my God, what this time has flown past.
Are we done?
We're done.
That's it?
Jack, thank you so much for coming and hanging out and talking Adventuring Academy.
It's been so fun being here. Thank you for having me.
I love it. We'll catch you guys next time. Take care.
Bye.
Woo! Hey gang, Brennan here. If you dig college humor and want to support what we do, sign up for Dropout. For the cost of a very big dumpling per month, you'll get videos like this a whole week sooner, chat with us live in the Dropout Discord, and exclusive content such as Dimension 20.
There are no stupid questions.
Are you my freaking dad?
So sign up for your free trial today. Or don't. Do what you think is right. I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. I don't even know you. That would be crazy. It was wrong of me to tell you what to do. I'm sorry, and that's on me. I'm ruining the CTA?